Welcome, everyone. We're glad that you found your way here. Hopefully, others will continue to trickle in. But this is our extra session to wrap up our seminar series on Tim Eastman's book, Untying the Gordian Knot, Process, Reality, and Context. Today, Tim will give a few remarks to start, and then he's asked myself and Michael Epperson to offer some summary remarks highlighting aspects of the book that we found important, and then we will, as usual, open it up for dialogue with everyone present. All right, sound good? Tim, I think I need to allow you to unmute, and the
Yes,
floor is
I'm
yours.
on mute. I think I'm all okay now. And so to speak, as a reminder, my integrative effort with Untying the Gordian Knot had its origins some 30 plus years ago, as I indicate in page 1, with the experience I had back along the Big Stone Lake in the rural area of western Minnesota, where I grew up. And I used that, so to speak, in combination with some comments on meaning and the end of chapter 8 as a bookend, sort of linking those, the spiritual experience early on, and then, so to speak, struggling with all these issues over the years, and finally coming back to a new understanding about, well, how could one possibly base reference to meaning in some as a real aspect of the world. So I have some reflections on Untying the Gordian Knot, which is a handout that's part of this, along with a set of references, about a page of selected references that don't themselves, and most of them don't show up in Untying, because mostly came after the publication of the book in December 2020. So check out that list, and you might find something. All of them are worth a look, I assure you. Anyway, so what I have attempted to do is with the Untying Gordian Knot is build on recent developments in logic, philosophy, semiotics, and quantum physics, among other fields, to in a new approach to affirming the reality of real possibility, both ontological and epistemic. And I've done this in part by hypothesizing two fundamental metaphysical order, both that of the Boolean order of actualization and a non-Boolean order of possible relations, or potentia. And in this way, treating these as fundamental metaphysical orders prior, and like pre-space, prior to, so to speak, reference to something like the space-time description, or metric description as used in relativity theory, it becomes then possible to newly conceive of how basic physical relations, or quote laws, could arise as constraints on potentia, as well as providing a new understanding of how such laws apply uniformly across the universe, which is the principal universality, for which these are notions for which, so far as I know, there's no other known explanation. Indeed, the Logi framework appears to function not just as one philosophical framework among others, but as a meta-philosophy that is in some ways capable of being a generator of philosophical and scientific hypotheses. For example, there are lists of Untying's potential contributions on pages 233 to 257, and hypotheses for the Gordian knot of problems on pages 66 to 81. So I offer this framework, which builds directly on the relational realism of Michael Epperson and Elias Safiris, and we have with us today Dr. Epperson to give comment, and the possibilism of Ruth Kashner, who has commented in a previous session, and who has another approach to interpreting quantum physics, both of these without changing the basic framework or the physics of quantum theory, but providing complementary complementary frameworks of understanding. And I think they're, from what I know, I think they're potentially equivalent, but that's yet to be determined, just in what way are the frameworks of Mike Epperson and Ruth Kastner is effectively equivalent. But I think on a pre-space level, in some way they are. And that these represent efforts that complement many excellent recent integrative works, Ken Wilber's and various others. But Untitled Gordian is my own particular unique contribution to an ongoing renaissance of integrative philosophical efforts, along with a strong heritage of process relational philosophy, including Whitehead, among others. The Logoi framework points to substantial synergy between system theory, semiotics, biosemiotics, and process relational philosophy. I think one synergy that has been not cultivated that needs to be, and that is between the worldwide intellectual and scholarly efforts in semiotics and biosemiotics with process philosophy. I think there's very much that could be taken advantage of there that is not yet fully utilized. So in part, the Logoi framework, one of the advantages, I think, is that it considers triadicity as primal for any and all physical relations. Thus, for any dyad, there's always some associated triadic relation, whether directly or indirectly. There's always some embedded context and or history from fundamental quantum process to the most intricate of complex systems. Complementary to this emphasis on the fundamentality of semiotic non-dyadic ontology and the importance of possibilist hypotheses and their concomitant generalized logic. There's also, as fleshed out by Professor Randy Oxley in a very insightful essay on Royce's philosophy, and by the way, Randy Oxley has been part of this dialogue series as well. And he concludes with a strong critique of non-possibilist realism that, quote, hypothesizes external relations, or also like nominalism, until it threatens the reality of a world of truth and a single universal world time, undermining what Whitehead would call the, quote, togetherness of the world. From these perspectives, self-conscious awareness and its subjective feeling arise from nonlinear feedback between, say, the reflexive contrast of that which is and that which could be, and active selection, quantum process potential to actualizations, and channeling of these processes through the neurological system and mental models, that is mapping in the spirit of Robert Rosen's work on complex systems, enabling varying levels of anticipatory capability. I might note that brain actualizations or brain states represent Boolean outputs or affected system measurements, which is often simply the reductive focus on standard neuroscience research, which is important for those such questions, but such research approaches, when focused solely on the order of actualizations and the correlations, cannot by themselves, in principle, quote, solve, unquote, the consciousness issue due to the neglect of landscapes of potentia. Rather, the mind can be thought of as a real emergent complex system that manages inputs, both the order of actualizations and the order of potentia, given both environmental context and interoception, and working via complex systems modeling of enfolding inputs and unfolding responses, makes and implements decisions. Neuropsychiatrist Daniel Segall provides useful detail about the relation of an expanded mind concept arising from information energy flows along with emergent consciousness within that, in addition to an emphasis on the transition from possibility to actuality. Such transition can be modulated not only during states of normal consciousness, but also in practices of focused meditation, meditative practice, as described in Segall's book, Mind, in 2017. A similar complexity applies to creativity and its underlying mental processes. From a Logoi framework perspective, creativity would correlate with enhanced tapping of the order of potentia. So in the last session, chapter 8, and then in several other places, I build on the work of an important work of philosopher James Bradley. And this is indicated in his collected essays, which came out in 2021 that I recommend for everyone, for whom, quote, meaning is enabled through multiple levels of context and through the interrelated combination of his three basic questions: the nature of origin, difference, and order. These questions and their answers correspond closely for origin to the concepts of potentia, the non-contingent and ultimates; for difference, succession, quantum process, and actualization in a diachronic manner, along with extension and multi-level emergence, that is a synchronic aspect; and for, quote, order, multi-level constraints on potentia, enabling Peircean generals or physical relations, that is laws. along with meaning from the above argument for an intrinsic ground for meaning based on input, output, context, triads at multi-level, finally to ultimate context, there could then possibly be a basis for reference to ethics in some real way in the world. Once again, within the logoi framework, the counterpart for creative possibility and meaning as realities in the world is the pre-space-time fundamental order of non-Boolean potentia, which contrasts with the fundamental order of Boolean actualizations. Besides indications of this understanding via possibilist interpretations of quantum physics, one might ask, could there be some additional route to testability in a broad sense? And I might note briefly that indeed, I think there may be a route to testability that is based upon a recent book by Christopher Botch, LSD in the Mind of the Universe. He describes a sequence of experiments using LSD, very carefully controlled over some period of 20 years. And my hypothesis would be that if you had a controlled experiment involving 20 to 30 people over a time frame of maybe 15, 20 years doing this, that the qualitative integrated result of that would potentially provide strong test of the hypothesis of, say, cosmic consciousness and tapping into some kind of non-Boolean order as a part of reality fully understood as being both the actual and the possible. With that, I'll turn back over to Matt. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim. Interesting hypothesis there, or a rather proposed experiment that we can talk about during the dialogue session, portion of this session. I want to now introduce Michael Epperson. Dr. Epperson has been with us to speak on a few occasions prior to this. He is the founding director of the Center for Philosophy and the Natural Sciences in the College of Natural Sciences and Mathematics at California State University in Sacramento, where he's a research professor and principal investigator. He's the author of a couple of really fantastic books. One, Quantum Mechanics and the Philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, and another co-authored with Elias Safiris, Foundations of Relational Realism, a topological approach to quantum mechanics and the philosophy of nature. As you heard from Tim, Dr. Epperson's work, or Michael, if I may, was very important for helping to frame the logoi framework. And so, Michael, I hand it over to you. I think you've already unmuted. Great. Let me get you spotlighted, and then the floor is yours.
No, that's intimidating. Spotlighted. I don't know what that means, but it sounds all right. But so a couple things before. Are we, because we started a little late, are we in a compressed time frame? Are we still ending at 10, or are we going to?
We're going to go a half hour over, so consider a normal time frame. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. And then the other thing is, well, now I'm spotlighted. I can't see everybody. Zoom is, I'm sure we're all sick of it, but I just want to say hi to the people that I know I haven't seen forever, John and Gary and Tim and Carolyn, and people I don't know also. I'd like to say hi, and hope everybody's staying safe and healthy out there, and hopefully we'll be back in person meeting and having these kinds of things in person, because I just hate Zoom. I'm sorry. Yeah. It's just the worst. I'm looking at a camera because, you know, you got to look at the camera in order for it to come across right. But then it's weird because it's like you're talking to yourself. So I'm going to be feeling like I'm talking to myself for the next few minutes. But anyway, hi, everybody. And I just wanted to say, Tim and I talked on the phone a couple of days ago, because I asked him, well, what would you like me to, to talk about at this meeting? Because there's so much to talk about. And he came up with an interesting idea, and that is that what I do at Cal State is I do a history and philosophy of science courses. So what that essentially involves is going all the way back to the beginnings of the history of science, which at least in the West, we'd say begins with the Milesians, in the 6th century BC. And the idea of it is that it's not just an intellectual exercise. The idea is that if you look at the evolution of conceptual frameworks, the conceptual frameworks that are fundamental to conventional science, you look at how these things evolved over time, what you end up finding is that there are concepts that are central along the way, they don't get abandoned. It's not as though we discovered that the concepts really aren't that great and then we improve them, as though the goal is to find the fundamental answers to the questions that we're asking scientifically. It's more like, and this is the essence of Kuhn, of course, it's more like what we're trying to do is not figure out or refine a fundamental answer. We're trying to refine the questions. And if you refine the questions as you go, then the concepts that you come up with end up becoming rehabilitated, as we go. We don't ever really throw away old ideas. We just reincorporate them and refine them into our new ideas in science. That just is what, through the lens of intellectual history, if you look at the evolution of science, that's what you see. The other thing you see is that these dualisms that are the academics talk about a lot, like science versus philosophy. A lot of physicists like Lawrence Krauss leaps to mind, but there's others too, that say, well, science is separate from philosophy and philosophy is terrible because all you do is spin your wheels. And philosophy of science is the worst, because they intrude on our fundamental questions and our fundamental answers. But really, if you look at it historically, and a lot of us already know this, but the word science as we use it today is it's natural philosophy. That's the enterprise. There's nothing different about the main difference between modern natural philosophy, aka science, and ancient natural philosophy, because the Greeks they had the word science, but they didn't use it the same way we use today. The main difference is that ancient natural philosophy is observational natural philosophy. Modern natural philosophy is empirical natural philosophy. There's a method that was invented in the 17th century that refines natural philosophy. So that's as we recognize today in science. But in the ancient period, they didn't have the empirical method. They had essentially observations. And by the time we get to Aristotle, it's logical observational natural philosophy. And logic is just as important today as it was back then, Aristotelian logic. So really the enterprise is the same, natural philosophy and modern science, especially something like fundamental physics. The goal ultimately is to refine the questions, to ask better and better questions. And along the way, again, going back to the Hellenic period, one of the big innovations that I don't see talked about very much, but it's very important in works like Tim's and the stuff I try to do, is this idea of an abstract, it's a very Whiteheadian idea as well, the significance of an abstract conceptual object. A conceptual object is not just an epistemic construction of the mind that we use to grasp physical reality, which is the ultimate reality, but rather an abstract conceptual object is as real as a concrete physical object. So there's this duality between concrete physical and abstract conceptual. And that's an interesting innovation, and it begins in the Hellenic period. If you're, I don't want to get into, do a lecture on Milesian natural philosophy, but essentially it was very reductive. The goal was to reduce the four fundamental elements, earth, air, fire, water, to just one. The Anaximander, who was one of these Milesians, introduced this idea of an abstract conceptual object. To my thinking, it's the first time such an object was introduced in this framework, and that is that there's this generic substance, this which you cannot perceive directly, but it's reasonable to assume there was really no formal logic then. So, but logically, probably he would have said, it makes sense that there would be this abstract object, which he called apeiron. It has no form, it's boundless, but it's real, it's a substance. And then Anaximenes, the third of the Milesians, he introduces, this I think is the most important thing for me about the Milesians, he introduces the concept of a force, an abstract, physically significant, but it's an abstract conceptual object of a force, not just a substance, but forces that act on the substances. For him, it was rarefaction and condensation, these opposing forces. This is a really important innovation because you don't ever perceive forces directly. You perceive them based on what they do to physical concrete objects that you can perceive. And he introduces this idea of a force. We see it in Empedocles later on in the 5th century with love and strife, attraction and repulsion. The forces are usually in opposition. And of course, we see this in modern electromagnetism as well. But this is a great innovation because you get a lot of mileage out of it. And the Pythagoreans around the same time, obviously they went crazy with the idea because there's nothing more abstract and conceptual as an object than mathematical objects, numbers. And they basically said, yeah, it's all, reality is fundamentally reducible to abstract conceptual objects, the numbers. And you see that reflected in some modern physics today. If you look at physicists like Max Tegmark, with his mathematical universe hypothesis, he's basically like a modern Pythagorean. Let's reduce everything in experience to just numbers. But I guess the point is we see this idea of an abstract conceptual object as something that we grasp with the mind in the same way that we grasp concrete physical objects with our senses, but we don't construct them. They're not merely constructs of the mind. They're not just tools or representations of what's ultimately real as concrete physical. But these things are objectively real in their own way. And this is so crucial to modern physics that we even forget that that's what we're doing. So the role of measurement context in Tim's framework and in the kind of framework that I'm working on, this is essentially the move. We're saying that contextuality is not just to be assimilated to subjectivity, therefore it's just a function of, the particulars of the subjective agent doing the subjective measurement. There's nothing fundamentally objective or real about it. No, measurement context in quantum mechanics is objective. It's objectively, its contributions to measurement are objectively measurable. The contributions themselves are measurable. And so there's something objective about contextuality. Not to say that we're reducing contextuality to something that's physical, but there's something meaningful about it in an objective sense. That's new. That's a new way of looking at quantum mechanics. By new, I mean, it's been emphasized really since the 1990s and the early 2000s, where we start really focusing on this feature of quantum measurement, that measurement context is super important. Ruth talks about it. She has a great paper that just came out a couple of months ago. I think it was in Foundations of Physics, where she talks about the importance of non-unitary evolution in quantum measurement, which is essentially when context kicks in, when measurement context kicks in and potential outcome states, which are very vague and hazy, become refined as probable outcome states. That phase of measurement was typically just kind of ignored. It's just, well, it's not really that important. It's von Neumann's process one. But now it's not ignored as much as it used to be, because it's crucial to quantum measurement. And there's no explanation. There's no way to reduce it to some other feature of quantum mechanics. It's its own thing, contextuality. Likewise, just more generally, we use the word, wave function. Oh, the wave function. The way it does this, it does that. People who do philosophy of science are always referring to the wave function. And we forget, I think, sometimes, because I've read phrases like, well, the wave function propagates through the apparatus, so that by the time it gets from point A to point B, it's changed. So it evolves in time. It's referred to as some kind of physical, concrete, mechanical wave, because that's the classical model paradigm by which we envision something like a mathematical wave. But the wave function is not a physical object in the form of a mathematical function. It's not a physical mechanical wave that takes the form of a mathematical function. I think that's how a lot of people think of it. The wave function is a mathematical function in the form of a mechanical wave. So the mechanical wave part of it, it's not fundamental to it. It's a handy way of trying to relate all of the mathematical ideas that are inside this thing. And in fact, you don't need a wave function. You can use a density matrix. There's a Heisenberg's matrix mechanics formulation, which I prefer because it doesn't inspire you to make that mistake, because there's a density matrix is purely conceptual. I mean, you just look at it, there's nothing physical about it. So you don't make that mistake of assimilating it to something concrete and physical. So it's all over quantum mechanics, these abstract conceptual objects as being fundamental, and they're physically significant. So these things have physical significance. Obviously, fields and field theory play that role. A lot of people think of a field, I'm just talking classical field theory, oh, it's fundamentally reducible to physical, what, particles zooming around? I don't know. You watch Star Trek, you would see I'm a big Star Trek fan. You got the force field and you assume, well, there must be little electrons or some kind of particle zipping around that you collide with and it makes the, no, this was the beauty of Maxwell, who basically made it pretty clear that a field is a mathematical structure. It's a mathematical structure fundamentally, and it has physical effects. So we never measure it directly. We measure its effects on physical things, but we always assume it's there. It doesn't just magically appear when there's physical things to be affected by fields. The fields are there. So we see it all throughout. And this is the genius of Whitehead, because he obviously knew all of this. And so what we have in, for me, Whiteheadian natural philosophy, is this attempt to show that really what's most important is not reduction. We want universality, and like in the way that Tim uses the term, but you don't need necessarily reduction if you have universality. Universality does not presuppose reduction to just one thing, in this case, physical, mechanical things. You could have universality where the fundamental object of that framework is relations. So we redefine relations not as just, I was about to use the word, it's relations, I'm gonna use it twice. Relations are not just relations between physical objects that are qualitative and then we quantify them, but rather relations can hold between physical objects or between conceptual objects or hybrids of both. And relations are the objects. We treat relations objectively. That's the move. So we don't just say it's physical, it's mechanical, therefore it's an object of modern physics. Modern physics has got way more conceptual objects in it than does physical objects, if you ask me. So we have to redefine what's objective about science, and what's objective is relations. Relations are the objects, and then we can relate relations. And we could use the mathematical formalism, which only captures parts of the relations. We don't reduce these relations to math. I mean, we don't. I don't. You can if you want. But the mathematics can be very handy, because we can then say, it's not about simple deterministic cause and effect, but in quantum mechanics, we see relations as affecting probability functions, probability distributions, conditionalizing probabilities. That's meaningful. And because when you conditionalize a probable outcome, you leave room for something other than just a reproduction of what the states were before in a deterministic way, because it's a probability function. Now you have the possibility for novelty and creativity. But it's not a free-for-all, because there's an objective conditioning of the creativity and the novelty by virtue of the relations between that particular relation and the rest of the universe, because again, the desideratum is universality. So I like Tim's framework because it emphasizes, look, physics is universal, that's the goal, but it can be universal without being reductive. And we can essentially be more explicit about our presuppositions by saying, we're using conceptual objects in modern physics in the same way that we use physical objects. And we should just stop with the whole dualism and stop attempting to reduce one to the other, and stop attempting to reduce conceptual to physical, but figure out a framework that uses both. And it's not all hand wavy, which is what a lot of people criticize philosophers of science as doing, because you can objectively and empirically demonstrate the function of conceptual objects in these relations. Again, it started with Maxwell, but it's certainly important in quantum mechanics, obviously. And so it's not hand wavy. It's very precise. It's just a matter of sort of hoping that the paradigm shifts a little bit to redefine conceptual objects and relations in this way. And to me, that's the important thing about Tim's book, because it shows the promise. If you would just make that move, then you can see how you could extend some of these ideas more broadly and non-reductively. And I think things are trending in that direction. It's difficult to do philosophy of science in this climate, because it's usually dismissed by both sides. Philosophers don't like it. I know from experience, because they don't really, well, who knows? They think you're trying to reduce philosophy to physics or something. And physicists generally don't like it either, because they look at it as an intrusion. So it's a kind of a boutique kind of cottage industry And so it's rough. It's rough going, but it's worth it because it just, in time, I think, and looking at the way quantum mechanics has been interpreted over the years, it's trending towards this viewpoint. It seems to me it's trending towards this paradigm shift. It's just going to take a long time. It's very gradual, but if you look at just the changes from the 1990s, when decoherence, not to get into the weeds of it, but decoherence is another conceptual function in quantum mechanics. It was dismissed in the 90s. It's, well, that's just a math trick. And now it's not at all. I mean, it's viewed as a fundamental physical process, purely mathematical and conceptual as a process, but it's fundamental to measurement. So in just a couple decades, we've seen a move in that direction. I think it's going to keep going in that direction, especially with with books like Tim's and other people who are trying to contribute in that direction. So that's all I have to say. I don't know how long I've been talking, but it seems like it's a good place to stop. So there you go. So congratulations again, Tim. It's an awesome book. I love it. And I'm going to use it in my classes.
Thanks very much, Michael. That was wonderful. Got a couple of questions written down for later for you. So I have prepared a few thoughts. I am not in a position to contribute in the sense of advancing the Logoi framework in the realms of quantum theory and in the ways that I think Michael is. And so I'm attempting instead to summarize and offer some connections to the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, where I feel more at home. So those of you who have read Science and the Modern World, Whitehead's 1925 book, his first after arriving at Harvard to begin teaching philosophy, will know that he warned that following the quantum and relativistic revolutions in physics, that scientific progress had reached a turning point, that the old foundations of scientific thought were becoming unintelligible. And he asks, what is the sense of talking about a mechanical explanation when you do not know what you mean by mechanics? And he adds that if science is not to degenerate into a medley of ad hoc hypotheses, then it must become philosophical by entering upon a thorough criticism of its own foundations. So right after Whitehead makes this warning, there was a sort of rise of positivist prohibition on speculative metaphysics, which handicapped progress, I would say, into the foundations of post-classical science, and ended up producing precisely the fragmented medley that he feared. Fortunately, a growing chorus of interdisciplinary scientists is taking up the philosophical work that was left unfinished by the early 20th century founders of quantum theory, who were way less reluctant to engage in these philosophical questions. And of course, Tim, in Untying the Gordian Knot, has not only shown his acumen as a physicist, but engaged in some high-level philosophy to add his voice to this ensemble, offering his Logoi framework as a meta-theory that aims not only to make ontological sense of quantum physics, but to integrate quantum theory with several other emerging 21st century frameworks, including complex system science, biosemiotics, and category theory. This alone would make Tim's book worthy of careful study, but he goes even further, sketching the plan for a bridge between science, or what he calls the way of numbers, and the human ethical and spiritual spheres, which he calls the way of context. We could say relative context for human ethics and culture, and ultimate context for the spiritual sphere. But despite the grand scope of his inquiry, Tim remains humble and conciliatory. He says the Logoi framework is not post anything, but a proto-worldview that's seeking to balance both theory and story, both systematic rigor and open-ended adventure. So Tim's masterful synthesis of dozens of cutting-edge researchers across numerous disciplines is impossible to fully summarize in these brief remarks, but in what follows, I want to offer just a few of the important contributions to the birth of a process relational science. So as Tim mentioned, he decided to study physics and philosophy not only because he wanted to understand the physical world, but because from a young age he intuited that this wondrous whole that we find ourselves within contained layers of meaning deeper than the merely measurable. Natural science has allowed human beings to reach beyond the mundane proportions of their sense organs and species-specific Umwelt toward extreme magnitudes in space and time. For example, telescopes extend our eyesight across vast distances of intergalactic space. We're waiting for the James Webb Space Telescope to come online, which will even further extend our vision. Microscopes peer into the nuclei of cells and even atoms. Inferences from radioactive decay rates of certain isotopes allow us to infer the age of fossils millions or billions of years into the past. Such techniques have dramatically expanded our understanding of the universe and our place within it. But in extending our senses to scales they were not evolved to perceive, often while using empirical concepts that are derived from human scale perception, we run the risk of succumbing to the sort of model-centric literalism that imagines we possess an outside God's eye view of an already finished universe. Tim, in his book, is seeking to re-embed the scientific perspective within the evolving universe that gave rise to it, such that, as he puts it, the most fundamental notions of natural science can be inferred from normal human experience. And this follows from Tim's commitment to the Whiteheadian ideal that, as Gary Hurstein and Randall Oxier put it in their book, The Quantum of Explanation, concrete existence explains the abstract aspects of experience and not vice versa. So Tim, in his book, carefully deconstructs the conceptual impediments to philosophical integration of post-classical science, such as actualism, nominalism, and determinism, arguing that potentials or potentiae, which is a term that I believe Tim borrows from Ruth Kastner, Stuart Kaufman, and Michael Epperson in their 2018 paper. Could be wrong. Not sure where the term originated exactly, but potentiae have a creative role to play that both upsets notions of efficient causal closure and reintroduces formal causes into our accounts of natural processes. While quantum physics has forced the issue, Eastman points out that it is misleading to construe even the formalisms of classical Newtonian physics as though they entailed strict determinism, since all such modeling frameworks make assumptions about initial and boundary conditions, relevant scales, and domains for meaningful solution. Granting potentiae real participation in the physical world not only allows science to consider the anticipatory capacities and creative agency of biological organisms, including that of scientists themselves, in a non-reductive way, it also resolves long-standing quantum puzzles, which resulted from trying to force-fit a classical mechanistic ontology to results that should indicate the need for a new process-relational ontology. Building on the relational reality model of Michael Epperson and Elias Safarius, Eastman, Tim, describes the evolution of quantum events from pure potential to probabilities to actualization when measured, a process which he describes that involves both logical conditioning and causal reiteration. Tim further argues that acts of measurement are not passive observations of already existing facts, but rather themselves establish new facts. There can be no ultimate causal closure, either for finite systems or for the universe as a whole, since the ontological unrest of newly emerging facts breaks any such closure. And here, Tim suggests a corollary for finite physical systems to Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems in logic. The universe thus becomes a cumulative succession of what Whitehead called actual occasions, wherein potentiae grow together with actualities by linking local causal interactions with global logical constraints in the ongoing process of realization. This process, as we've heard from Tim and from Mike, includes both a standard Boolean dyadic logic of actualizations, or what we could call res extensae, and a triadic logic of potentialities, res potentiae. Tim argues that, I quote, dyadic relations do not, in fact, exist in the real world, only in the world of abstract modeling. This is because context is inevitably involved, and because the relationship between potentiality and actuality is inherently asymmetrical, from whence comes the arrow of time. Tim's logoi framework thus carries forward Whitehead's crucial distinction in process and reality between the logical order of concrete events, or what he calls genetic division, and the causal order of metrical spacetime, or coordinate division. The former is rooted in quantum process and is given primacy, while the latter, rather than being conceived of as a pre-existing continuum serving as a container for processes, is secondarily emergent from such processes. Grasping the significance of Tim's logoi framework may be aided by contrasting it with popular actualist accounts. Tim critiques the physical theory of everything articulated by Sean Carroll in his book, The Big Picture, where Carroll takes up a sort of God's eye perspective, offering a single, what he calls core theory, which is an equation combining quantum mechanics, space-time, gravity, matter, the Higgs field, and other forces, which Carroll claims, when combined, leave no room for any new aspects of the universe that are not already well understood. And Tim points out that while the components of this core equation indeed represent great achievements, in practice, no one has ever succeeded in combining them into a practical model or simulation. Sean Carroll's core theory thus amounts to no more than a mashup and is not anywhere close to being a working equation. Now, to Carroll's credit, he's one of the relatively few physicists who's willing to engage deeply with philosophers and philosophy of science, and so that's really wonderful. He has a popular podcast called Mindscape. He's constantly inviting philosophers on to engage in discussion and dialogue, but he seems, I think, wedded to certain metaphysical presuppositions which he doesn't recognize as such, or which he thinks that somehow physics has at least provided weighty evidence in support of, that Mike and Tim are both trying to challenge here. So moving ahead a little bit to save some time, Whitehead's cosmology, along with Charles Saunders Peirce and contemporary physicist Lee Smolin, all of them are often interpreted as implying that physical law is more a matter of empirical probability rather than being metaphysically grounded. And since deism is no longer a live option for scientists, as it was in Descartes and Newton's day, very few practicing physicists have attempted to ground law metaphysically. Tim suggests that the closest thing contemporary physics has to such a metaphysical ground for physical laws are so-called symmetry principles. But from Tim's perspective, these principles remain groundlessly circular descriptions unless they are accompanied by a process relational or some adequate ontology. Now, Peirce attempted to reformulate laws as habits, but in Untying the Gordian Knot, Tim worries that this may be a category error that, despite Peirce's realist intentions, falls prey to a kind of nominalism. For Tim, genuine habits can only be said to emerge at the biological level, as I understand him. So without wanting to affirm deductivism or determinism, he nonetheless thinks that necessity must have some purchase in nature for the findings of modern physics to make any sense. He thus argues that nature's laws derive not from any deductive necessity, but rather from the conditional contingency of trajectory optimizing histories. For example, the principle of least action. He compares these to Leibniz's striving possibles, and this issue of the status of law when habit can be said to emerge in nature, whether only at the biological or perhaps earlier, is a question I'd love to return to during our dialogue. Let's see what. Okay, so let me skip ahead here. So, although Eastman, Tim, creatively expands upon Whitehead's process philosophy, he does so without remaining unduly tied to the latter's categorical scheme. He emphasizes Lehman McHenry's interpretation of Whiteheadian prehensions as concrete functions rather than abstract relations, thus contrasting Whitehead's third approach to his former collaborator Bertrand Russell's nominalistic logical atomism. Now, this term prehension, Tim follows Charles Hartshorne in seeing this concept of prehension that Whitehead develops as an important symbolic bridge for helping bring together the knower and the known, particularly when it has to do with understanding emergence in nature. And Eastman agrees with Hartshorne's sense that prehension is perhaps the most powerful metaphysical generalization ever accomplished, right? As it allows all sorts of relations, whether those involving memory, perception, causality, subject-object, or God-world relations, to be accounted for in terms of one generic type. Now, prehension is defined by Lehman McHenry in its physical mode as the present occasion's absorption of past actual occasions in its process of self-creation, from McHenry's 2017 book. This leaves out the role, though, of conceptual prehension in Whitehead's scheme, that is, the present occasion's ingression of potentials or eternal objects in its process of self-creation. McHenry, who Tim is drawing on here, appears to question the need for Whitehead's eternal objects, at least if they are given a Platonic emphasis. Tim claims that his account of diachronic process in terms of pre-space potentia plays a role similar to that of Whitehead's prehensive unification, a concept Whitehead introduces in Science and the Modern World. Despite approving of Whitehead's perspectival account of the relation between universals and particulars as an aspect of his concept of eternal objects, Tim seems sometimes to indicate a desire to distance himself from Whitehead's eternal objects, thus implying that there may be important differences between his landscapes of potentia and the realm of eternal objects. And I think this is a fertile area for further philosophical exploration. It's come up in prior sessions, particularly in dialogue with Randy Oxier. But maybe this is another thing we can return to during the dialogue. I would offer briefly right now that one way of beginning to explore this question stems from asking whether the choice of realism over nominalism as regards the status of form in nature, whether it entails Platonism. And Eastman thinks it does not, but given that Plato wrote dialogues and not doctrines, it all depends what we mean by Platonism. Regardless of the nature of Tim's divergence from Whitehead's category of eternal objects, Tim and Whitehead clearly share, as does Peirce, a rejection of nominalism. Tim puts forward an argument against nominalist actualism that is rooted in quanta potentiae that integrate local global interactions without themselves having any specific space-time location, right? They are generals in Peirce's sense, as Tim mentioned earlier, serving as logical constraints on physical processes. So from Tim's point of view, admitting potentiae back into nature is far more parsimonious than the actualist, nominalist interpretations of quantum theory that lead to, for example, the many worlds and multiverse hypotheses. At the end of his book, Tim concludes trying to link human and cosmic logoi in search of some sense of the deeper meaning of our existence. While he's careful to avoid any monological fixations, he builds on the work of a physicist, George Ellis, who developed a kenotic morality wherein human values like truth, goodness, and beauty, in Ellis's terms, reflect the forces or intentions that created the universe as part of the deep structure of the cosmos. Tim also amplifies Robert Neville's concern about, as Neville puts it, the enormous damage to human civilization resulting from the loss of value reference and realistic valuation in the context of modern materialistic science. With characteristic caution and modesty, Tim seeks to contrast his own logoi framework, which aims at evidence-based methodology. He aims to contrast it with advocacy-based thinking, even though there are implications for our worldview, for ethics. He's nonetheless trying to develop an evidence-based methodology, leaving the advocacy, which is not inappropriate when it's done in the cultural and political spheres, but leaving that to philosophers perhaps, and really trying to advance our scientific understanding and allowing, though he's not afraid to draw connections that would lead to a shift in worldview, right? He's not really starting his argument on that basis, right? And then, of course, in the final pages, Eastman honors the Dakota peoples upon whose land he first had the spiritual experience that initiated his inquiry into the nature of reality. I want to share his words there, and then I'll bring this to a close. Tim says from page 274, in confronting the psychological challenges of nihilism, denialism, and assorted despairs. Uh-oh. You may have just lost my camera. Sorry about that. I'm back. Sorry. In confronting the psychological challenges of nihilism, denialism, and assorted despairs of contemporary life, in facing up to the physical threats of war, pandemics, human suffering, and in newly realizing the deteriorating Earth's climate, ecology, and habitability, can we somehow embrace what we have learned through science and philosophy, and what we may yet draw on from indigenous and other spiritualities, so as to bring into being a world in which we humans can live and flourish over the long term? And I think Tim has succeeded in making a major contribution toward just such an integral embrace. So those are my remarks. At this point, I would invite Tim to chime in response to anything Michael and I have shared, and then we can open it up to the rest of the participants.
Thank you, Matt and Michael. Excellent comments, and also thanks to both of you for your role in enabling this dialogue series, and also to Mike and Elias and to Ruth Kastner for making possible that those precursors that enabled the very possibility of the integration I have attempted, and to John Cobb and David Griffin and other representatives of the process relational framework that who've been, John especially has been mentor to me for the last 30 plus years, and all of this would absolutely be not possible with and also what I've done here is just, so to speak, a small increment with respect to trying to bring together some new developments in the past 20, 30 years that could in some way help push the process relational strategy forward a little bit, to suggest new approaches for good, effective scholarship, and to remind people that there are some dead ends, there are many rabbit holes, and we all need to be cautious about rabbit holes. I mean, the rabbit hole of actualism, the rabbit hole of simplistic determinism, mechanistic thinking, and I was there. As an early trained physicist, steeped in classical mechanics and the usual kinds of interpretation. That was part of my thinking for some time, and it took me a while to then, rethink those things. And then when I read Mike's work and realized that by virtue of looking at in a new way at fundamental logic, of the distinction from algebraic quantum theory of, as brought out also in right now I'm a blank on another work that complements Mike's, emphasizing the distinction at the most fundamental logic level of a Boolean logic and a non-Boolean logic, a logic of the actuals and logic of the possible, to recognizing that distinction being important to quantum physics. When I first realized that some 10 years ago, it was like aha experience, like, wow. Then I could see a whole new avenue towards making the argument about why a process relational approach, a White-Eddy approach, and these various avenues, so to speak, the logoid framework, gradually came together, and that's what I was trying to articulate in the book. And it was a great struggle, and there's a lot of missing pieces. And I encourage all of you who are coming into this to encourage others to pick it up, to take to the next stage. I think I think it's not my role to take it to the next stage. I think I'm not like a Whitehead. I can't write multiple books. I think this is kind of it in terms of what. But I'll certainly try to work with others too. But I want to just, it's like pass it on. It's for others to take to the next stage. But it was exciting to, many times I had this right in the middle of the night, multiple times I'd wake up with some realization about something, and then I bring Carolyn coffee in the morning, as I do every morning, and then we're sharing coffee. I said, hey, guess what happened? It's 3 a.m. And so then and then I tell her about this new way of understanding the combination of causation and emergence that came out of the blue. And that was just one among, it was, the last 10 years have been by far the most creative period of my life. And here it's just a labor of love. I've really enjoyed it, and I pass it on to others. And I think everyone is a real scholar, has that experience, that creative moment. And I'm just very lucky to have had several cases of that as part of this effort. And thank you very much for all of you for your participation, and encourage you all to identify a portion here as something to take forward. There are all kinds of loose ends in what I have done. So thank you.
Thank you, Tim. It's quite an achievement, and we're grateful to you for putting in those many long nights of effort to get this written, waking up in the middle of the night when those insights come. But yes, as you say, it's a proto worldview, and I'm eager to continue to try to carry this work forward in whatever ways I can, and I know I'm not alone.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, with respect to the term proto worldview, I picked that up from the great scholar who's with us, Mikhail Epstein. I believe he signed on. And so thank you so much for that contribution and for your insightful comments on humanities and new approaches of understanding. Thank you so much to Professor Epstein. Perhaps he wishes to make a comment.
Yeah, I would be glad to make some comments if you
Please
allow me. Yeah, some personal view on Tim's book. As a Russianist and as a person who worked in cultural studies, philology, philosophy, I felt a kind of isolation in my intellectual pursuit. And when I published 20-some years ago a book, A Philosophy of the Possible, Modalities in Thought and Culture, I felt myself to be isolated in the world of possibilist thought, because my thesis against the prevailing approaches to the possible, and there were different approaches, nominalistic, realistic, conceptualistic. My approach was not nominalistic or realistic approach to the possible, but possibilistic approach to language, to reality, to thinking. And this is what I find so compelling and kindred spirit, kindred mind in Tim's logo framework, that possibility, potential, is not just how to say, the object, the theme, the talk to elaborate on, but the criterion, the mode of perception of all realities, both humanistic and physical and biological and semiotic, looking through the prism of possibilism and potentiation. Tim uses the term potential, and this is term probably number one in his worldview. But I believe that it's also about potentiation as a process. That means that not only actualization of potential happens through physical world, but it is also potentiation of actualities of the physical world, which happens through our consciousness, and is, of course, the field of the humanities and philosophy and metaphysics, which enormously potentialize the world of actualities. That means offers multiple wave-like, so to say, interpretations of reality, and therefore, in a kind of circular way, communicates with those potential that precede actualization. So for me, it is like all-embracing process of physical actualization of potential and then spiritual, intellectual potentiation of actualities, coming to, again, to the world of potential, but now spiritual potential. And and I find, though I was a little bit familiar with Whitehead before, but of course, these discussions in the circle of seasoned Whiteheadians are very important for me, because this is where I feel the future of philosophy is, not with analytical tradition, which is very boring, exhausting, very flat, and doesn't help us to understand that philosophy as a way of potentiation of the world is the future of technology, the future of science. Actually, it is the most transformative idea that can be suggested to unify both technology, science, the humanities, cultural futurologism and linguistic futurologism. So I believe that this book, Tim's book, Logo Framework, can serve as a really point of consensus among various disciplines on the basis of potential and potentiation to join our multidisciplinary efforts in offer the appropriate philosophical platform for the theory of everything, because theory of everything cannot be just physical theory or biological theory or any single disciplinary theory. It should be, of course, multidisciplinary. And for that, I am very grateful to Tim and to all colleagues. This was really for me a moment of, how to say it, coming from a closet, disciplinary closet of my past possibilism, lonely possibilism. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikhail. Very good comments. And I might note that Dr. Epstein also has a book on possibility, I believe translated from the Russian, is quite relatively recent. I encourage you, those here to check that out. And I noted that Thomas Royce has brought up a question in the chat, most interesting question about, this relative to the dominance of actualism and deterministic presumption among scientists and so forth. To what extent might I think that the acceptance of something like logo framework, a new integrated framework, could be yet possible? And I think this relates to a discussion I had with Mike Epperson this past week, and that is, up through the mid-19th century, it was, so to speak, presumed that we had to do scholarship of a scientific sort with the interaction, the interrelationship of the logic, the philosophy, the mathematics, and the science, so to speak, integral natural philosophy. In fact, I have a book called Natural Philosophy, dated 1870, which I sent off to Mike Epperson. So he has a good concrete example of that in his hand. And yet in the past century, with the great advances of mathematical physics and of rather reductive science, it's become almost commonplace to simply presume that the standard language, the rigorous language, is always somehow science itself or science-based, and that sort of his new standard of rigor. And I agree with the notions that we should be as rigorous as we can in the context, but the difficulty is that that we now understand from the recent discussions and efforts in understanding quantum physics that the philosophic aspect is essential and key to understanding quantum physics. That's also true for relativity theory. So I think the actual fact of contemporary philosophy of physics is an example of why one needs to attend to not just the mathematics and the physics, but you have to do the mathematics, the physics, and the philosophy and logic. You have to do them as an integral piece, so to speak, as a new natural philosophy. That's what Mike suggested to me. What we need is a new natural philosophy in which you don't neglect that. And if you just assume you can reduce it to nothing but, say, propositions that are context independent in a reductive scientific mode, that in actualism, that's scientism. That's not science in a broader sense. And I think the new science, the new natural philosophy, needs to be combining all of these, the logic, the philosophy, the mathematics, the physics, the science, and the philosophy in a more integral way, and to not somehow pretend that subsets of that in one's model, all such models being temporary routes to providing solutions for specific focused problems, but to make broad inclusive claims and to then not reference the role of context and not reference the role of the history, not reference the philosophic dimension, to me is simplistic reductionism. It's scientism. That's not the best of science. That's not the most rigorous of science. We need to advance scholarship in a way that is truly inclusive, in a way that's pointed to by Dr. Epstein and the other scholars that are all part of this discussion. So I think eventually I'm hoping that the best of science and philosophers will come around and recognize the need for such a integrative approach and get away from the kind of reductionism, which I think has actually been counterproductive, if not actually undermining their own agenda. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim, for addressing that great question from Thomas. Thomas, unless you have any follow-up, I see Kent had a question, but Thomas, did you want to add anything?
Thomas Royce?
If I were to add anything, it would be in relation to the discussion about Zoom. I happen to think that it's one of the greatest things that's happened to me in my life, simply because prior to these type of what would you say, gatherings, I had no option or no ability to interact with people of the stature that I see in this group. And so I have to say, as a rank amateur and all of these things, I feel a bit like a punk kid who's managed to sneak into a jam session amongst a bunch of rock stars. And even though I'm constantly reminded when I'm here about just how thick-headed I can be, I seem to learn something every time that I'm here. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. And I hope things of this nature can continue.
Thank you,
Oh.
Thomas.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. And I might note, Thomas, that you are too modest in the sense that all good science, good scholarship really is articulating good questions. And you articulated a really good question. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, can I just jump in really fast to say, I didn't mean to sound like a baby about the Zoom because it's just having to teach with Zoom for 2 years. That is really what I was trying to convey, that it's a wonder. You're right, Thomas. I'm grateful for it because it's easy to participate in conversations you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. It's just, I fear that a lot of times, at least in academia, as soon as a new tool comes along that's useful in certain circumstances, it's almost like there's a drive to reduce all of pedagogical theory to that tool. And that's kind of what's been happening in college these days, because we all had to learn it. And now that everyone's learned it, now everyone wants to use it all the time. And I'm thinking, oh, it scares me a little bit. Yeah. That's all I was trying to say.
Well, another feature is that sometimes people think that everything's online so that you just put Google search and you can get whatever you need and everything is available. Well, that's not true. My wife, Carolyn, was administrator at the Library of Congress for many years, just retired in 2014 after leading the Kluge Center of Scholars. And she knows firsthand that of the resources at the Library of Congress, like more than 95% are not available online. They're not digitized. So we have a long way to go to have a fully digitized memory of human documentation.
Yeah. So I think, Michael, you might be thinking of having to lecture to students, most of whom will turn off their videos. And so you're just talking into the void. And, I don't enjoy that either. But this is a more lively group.
Jude Jones, maybe you have something to offer or share with us, given your experience with the education and teaching at Fordham.
Let's go to Jude in just a sec if we can, because I wanted to acknowledge Kent's question, and then you'll be next, Jude. Go ahead, Kent.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Tim, and everyone else for this series. This has been really quite amazing to be able to listen to all these sessions, and I've got a lot out of them. I guess my question is around what next in terms of this larger issue. What I would characterize as this real focus of substance metaphysics, and what is going to kind of be the catalyst and to move into more of a process relational metaphysics. And if you feel like quantum ontology is the real highly leveraged point, where the work of Epperson, Zafiris, and Kastner, and Michael, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well in terms of if you see that as a real highly leveraged point. For me, I see the work of say David Chalmers has a new book called Reality Plus, which my day job, I do a VR podcast. So I had a chance to do an interview with him. And I feel like there's some interesting things he's talking about in terms of simulation theory and how that's potentially recasting some of these different metaphysical assumptions that we have. But in particular, the experiential aspect, I think, is another leverage point that I see, at least in terms of Chalmers is arguing that we shouldn't be contrasting the virtual reality with real reality, that we should be contrasting it with physical reality versus the virtual reality. So there's a interesting thing that's happening from an experiential perspective of trying to make these differentiations from an experiential perspective, that the virtual reality is a genuine reality, is what Chalmers is arguing. But I feel that there is, I had a chance to ask him about what he thought about process relational metaphysics, but he hasn't really dug into Whitehead so much. But I feel like there's the core of the argument of saying that there's aspects of the virtual reality that is just as real, that starts to move towards a more of a process relational ontology. And I had actually a chance to interview Matt for my podcast as well, kind of digging into that. But I'd love to hear just some general thoughts of what you see as potential leverage points in the larger cultural landscape of ideas when it comes to moving away from this kind of real reductive materialism, physicalism, and substance metaphysics into more of a process relational metaphysics.
Can I jump in just quick to answer?
Please.
Because I love the question. I'm consumed with that question all the time. And I would say, just again, based on the history of science and the history of scientific progress, you're going to see a real move once there is some sort of tangible technological application of this new paradigm. And what you see we haven't really seen it in quantum measurement until fairly recently with this new, it's very exciting aspect of quantum measurement these days has to do with a phenomenon called topological phase shifts. And basically, in a nutshell, without getting into the weeds, topological, or usually they're called geometric phases, but really they're topological. They've been known and acknowledged for a long time, and they've been acknowledged as kind of a hiccup. It would be, Kuhn would call it an anomaly, not really a critical anomaly, but it's like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, but it's fundamentally meaningless because you can just kind of ignore the manifestation of this interesting thing, this phase shift. But now we're discovering that no, what the idea is, by making a local measurement where you can measure this phase shift, you get global information about the state of the system from a local measurement. The easiest analogy would be like a Foucault's pendulum, in a museum. By measuring this, and there's a phase, but it shifts because it rotates. And by looking at that shift, which is a local measurement, you get some information about something going on globally beyond the context of that individual measurement. And the reason that's interesting technologically is it allows for the possibility of probing a system non-locally and getting information about a system in a way that you could never do classically. So I think something like that is going to really kickstart the shift away from the mechanical paradigm, because there's no classical mechanical explanation for something like that. Also, keep an eye on Microsoft's quantum computing team, because I'm not a fan of quantum computing, at least in terms of the way it's been oversimplified as to what it can actually do. But they're using this notion of topological phases in order to sort of, that's their focus. I think they're the only team really focusing on it. And they've made some very interesting progress with it. And it's very Whiteheadian, by the way. I think you'll see that as that develops, people are going to be looking for a conceptual framework that can accommodate some of these interesting, spooky, action at a distance type phenomena. So I think something like that is really going to kickstart the move into a better metaphysics. And then your second point, which I thought was a really, really interesting question about simulation theory, essentially. I'm so tired of hearing about simulation theory. I'm so tired of this argument about VR. I think VR is great. Will it be a replacement for R? I think, again, quantum mechanics gives us a hint in the sense that it's an exemplification of the metaphysics. There's an interesting thing about quantum mechanics, and that is that you cannot embed the global state into a global Boolean algebra. Now, a computer, any kind of digital framework, has to be able to do that, right? You have, so imagine you have a book full of word problems in algebra. It has to be the case that there is a global algebra that is that all of the different word problems on every page of the book can be embedded within, and that it's consistent. But quantum mechanics gives us proof that there is no such global Boolean algebra in which you can embed physical reality at the global scale. This has been proven mathematically by Simon Kochen and the Kochen-Specker theorem, but it's also just a fact of quantum measurement. And so that, to me, is the key. It demonstrates that there is no way to just assimilate the global to the local or the local to the global. And you would have to be able to do that with, the metaverse or with the, a perfect simulation. And that would look qualitatively different than our world. In other words, if there is a global Boolean algebra in which you can embed this idea of a global state vector in quantum mechanics, the world would look very different than this world, the real world. Not useless. It's not like, oh, it wouldn't be fun. I love video games, and I love, the fact that even though I know I'm playing a video game and I know everything is globally Boolean in the game, it's still fun. And it might be useful, like Zoom is useful for meetings like this. But as to some sort of idea that reality can be reduced to the idea of a simulation is just science fiction. And it annoys me when I hear people talking too much about it and spending a lot of money investigating it, when just simple understanding, not a simple understanding, but at least a somewhat deeper understanding of things like quantum mechanics and natural philosophy more broadly in the 21st century, you would dispense with questions like that and focus your efforts on something else, and not try to overextend this very interesting thing, virtual reality, overextended into something like some kind of fundamental question about reality. That I find annoying. it's understandable, but we need to be better, I think, about acknowledging the conceptual foundations of our scientific theories, so that you don't talk fast and loose about things like quantum mechanics, the wave function example I gave, or things like VR or simulation theory, and certainly not investing billions of dollars like Zuckerberg thinks there's some big promise there. That to me is frustrating when there's so many other problems in the world we should be probably focusing our mental energies on. But that's just me venting, like I was doing with Zoom, so I apologize. But I hope that's my view of an answer to your two questions.
Yeah, that's great, Michael. I just shared in the chat that there's a long history of mistaking the latest technological innovations for ontology, or hypostatizing a technology, whether it's the clock or the steam engine or the computer or VR. These new technologies give us interesting analogies, to ask interesting questions about the nature of nature. But this rush to identify the brain with a computer, or etc., I think is kind of lazy thinking. But there's another aspect of Kent's question that I wanted to address, which is, and this relates to what Thomas was asking as well. To my surprise, panpsychism is beginning to catch on among analytic philosophers of mind. Philip Goff is the biggest name here, but there are others. And I've had a chance to dialogue with Goff. He's the author of a book called Galileo's Error, if you're not familiar. But in his own way, he's kind of critiquing the bifurcation of nature in that book. But in talking to Goff, I was asking why he builds his approach to panpsychism on a sort of throwaway comment by Bertrand Russell about physics only telling us about the structure of matter and nothing about its intrinsic nature. And Russell suggests, well, maybe its intrinsic nature is consciousness or experience. And that's the basis for Goff's whole project. And I asked, well, why didn't you choose Whitehead instead? He has a rather more elaborate, metaphysical scheme that works out how, maybe not panpsychism, but panexperientialism could be applied across various domains, from physics to human experience. And he didn't have a good answer. He said he didn't quite understand it. And I asked him about, it seems to me that his panpsychism is very much a substance property form of panpsychism. And I've come to realize that the process relational approach to, let's call it panexperientialism, following David Griffin's suggestion, it's as different from substance property panpsychism as it is from materialism, right? And so this shift to a process ontology is really crucial. And even if panpsychism does become more popular in the form that Goff is articulating it, we're still stuck in actualism. We're still stuck in substance ontology. And so it's not actually addressing some of the quantum puzzles that a process ontology could address. And so I'm starting to be more disappointed, even though I was initially excited by the rise of panpsychism. It's moving in the wrong direction, I think. So
I'd love to hear if there's any other thoughts that Tim may have in terms of next steps, or if this larger discussion around substance metaphysics and process relational metaphysics.
Well, I think the whole field of philosophy of physics and interpretation of quantum physics is a very important subgroup of scholars within the physics and philosophy. At least that's a group that really explicitly acknowledges the importance of the combination of the science and the philosophy. And that bridge, I think, is so important to lots of areas, including, like, say, philosophy of biology and so forth. But it's important to all areas of science and scientific interpretation, as I would argue, with the understanding of rethinking in terms of a new natural philosophy, as Mike Epperson encourages. So yes, I think as inroads and as possible developments of, I think it could be very influential if a few lead scientists, say physicists, really took on this. I think the philosophy of physics area is an example where it's beginning to make a real impact. But then again, the difficulty is that some, such as Gerhard de Hooft, are so committed to determinism and actualism that they can't see outside of the box, in my view, even though they're exceedingly skilled in other respects.
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Kent. I see Gary's hand up, but I wanted to make sure that Jude had a chance because Tim called on you earlier. Did you want to chime in, Jude?
Sure. Eventually, I'm going to ask Tim to clarify, the question about education, but things have evolved since then. It's interesting. Many years ago, right after Conscious Mind came out, I don't know how I even wound up invited to it, but I was at a conference, small conference on Chalmers' book and Chalmers' work, and I implored him to read Whitehead after, my paper, which, linked what he was doing with Whiteheadian concepts. And he was basically, begging for a shortcut because, it takes commitment to read and absorb, process metaphysics alongside everything else. So, he's had that recommendation out there for a long time, and it doesn't sound like he's done it yet. But it's interesting because I was just, Kent, I actually had my students read an interview with Chalmers on the Reality Plus book. It was on a podcast or a taped interview with Vox magazine, where he was talking about this and the question of where virtual reality stands in relation to reality, and part of what, and this will lead back to the education stuff, part of what he was talking about in the full interview was the fact not so much of VR coming to be a stand-in or an equal, or from what I can tell, I haven't read the book yet, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but that it raises a lot of questions that I think are akin to what we're talking about here, which is that part of what we're doing when we're talking about reality and examining, what are our fundamental constructs that are most useful about it, is related to questions of meaning making. That people are, and my students among them, willing to entertain the possibility that reality is bigger than our standard concepts, including the reductive materialistic view, when they think of it in terms of the meaningfulness of various structures, experiences, etc., in their lives, and wanting to recognize those as real, right? Even, so the experience of fiction, of art, of music, as bona fide revelations of modalities of reality, even though they're quite different from the sort of, standard scientific model that they're all sort of brought up breathing and eating. And Chalmers is also trying to be careful there, and I imagine the book goes into this, that that we can't conflate the question of reality with the question of meaning, but we can't separate them either. And so the virtual in the meaning space of discussions of reality, has its place as an enhancing, as a legitimate contender for being called a kind of reality, a level of reality, a register of reality. I worry about level talk because it hierarchizes, but maybe a register of reality might be a better term. And so, getting back to the education question, then, this really excited my students, but also perplexes them because they come in born and bred with a certain kind of, well, of course, the world is just what physics and biology tell us it is. Although maybe some students with, abiding, religious convictions or other kinds of practices that suggest that there's more to the story, maybe don't buy into that. But even them, they think, well, science is true. Science is obviously true. And so how do we align all these other things that we'd also like to say are real alongside that, true description, allegedly, quote unquote, that science gives us? And I think we're at a moment, I experience it anyway in my own teaching, that it's a point of genuine perplexity, like an existential perplexity, that the pandemic has only exacerbated because it made people turn in on themselves in terms of, really having to examine what's important, what is meaningful, what is the world about, what does the future look like? Not just the pandemic, but all the challenges that we have in front of us that, John Cobb has been so, incredibly inspiring in trying to turn our creative energies towards dealing with them. they recognize that there are limits to the resources that have been authorized to deal with that, but haven't yet been able to intellectually harness it. And I think these kinds of models, Chalmers was an interesting thing. I'm gradually easing them towards the kind of Whitehead thing. They haven't read it yet, but it's a moment of perplexity that I think we could make creative use of, but it's also really challenging. How do you enter into a generational mindset that has adopted something not as a dogma, but just as obviously true? But these challenges right now have created an opportunity to move that a little bit, because I think there's a recognition that something's missing. And so I'm keen to hear what anybody has to say. I don't have any great answers, but I think it's a moment of creative opportunity in the embrace of the possible rather than the actual. So I think that's enough of a spiel for me.
Well, thank you, Jude. Let me, so to speak, come back to something I brought forward in the first chapter of Untying the Gordian Knot, and that had to do with the fundamental ways of knowing. And I think it helps to emphasize the limitations of science. If we frame that science is fundamentally trying to identify propositions that are context independent, so that the physical law can be applied on planet Earth or Mars or some extraterrestrial stellar system, wherever. So it'd be context independent, and we apply models and map those into mathematical forms to try to get at what are the fundamental propositions that are as context independent as we can, that then in turn also help to solve physical problems. But there's also sets of propositions that are context emphasized, or that for which you emphasize context, that also are part of the real experience more inclusively, as brought out very much in the work of Mikhail Epstein and all of us. So to me, those are sets of propositions such that to think of the propositions that are context independent. That's not all of science, of course. You got boundary conditions and other kind of interpretive discussions that are context dependent. On the other hand, the emphasis is towards Boolean thinking and context independent propositions, so that tends to make scientific propositions per se necessarily limited and constrained, and to claim that they somehow are universal and, well, in the sense of being all inclusive, a scientism, an actualism, to me is misunderstanding them. And so we need to see it as a distinct way of knowing, emphasis on context independence, but also along with those things that emphasize context dependence, poetry and literature and history, all kinds of history. So it's so important to incorporate the context and history into one's understanding of things, because now we're caught up in a contemporary world with so many people indulging in context denialism, in history denialism, and all sorts of denialisms that depend upon this kind of, and it becomes even dangerous to be involved with, dialogues that fail to grapple with that complexity of the real world. So that's why I think the way of knowing in terms of an emphasis on context independence, science, the emphasis on context dependence, humanities and so forth, and pointing to ultimate context, the spiritual dimension. We need all three.
Yeah, it was an exciting moment yesterday. I actually was trying to push for pedagogical purposes, an idea that there's no such thing as truly context independent statements. I'm a born and bred Whiteheadian, so, even though science aspires in that direction, is not really true. So I was talking to one of my students who came to office hours to talk about, what is phenomenology, and we wound up, getting to a lot of things. And he said, well, we were talking about first person experience, and he said, and I said, there's a sense in which, phenomenologists want to say that there's no stepping outside of that, which is not a veil between us and reality, but that just is, how we deal with this. He says, well, what about the third person point of view? And he just thought, well, clearly we can do that. And I said, well, what is that third person point of view? That somehow is, context independent. And I could just sort of see his head exploding. Sort of moved into a different frame of reference. So I was very pleased with that moment, that I think was a hopeful moment in the direction of what Tim is urging us towards.
Yeah. Very good. Thanks.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay. Gary, thanks for your patience. Go ahead.
Well, I want to thank Tim. I really echo this. I'm an amateur and I am in the presence of a bunch of rock stars. That metaphor was great. But at my own personal cognitive bias level, meaning seems to be a very fundamental issue. That we have the work of, say, Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins working with psilocybin. The majority of people that go through that experience say they were completely absent their ego, that they had some sense of being in the presence of God and that it was the most meaningful experience of their life. And so you have that Jung contribution that psyche is real, that's absent from the materialist perspective. Psyche is real. And he makes the case that that the reality of God is personal experience. That absent all those truth claims of the mainstream religions, the experience of God we don't want to ignore as a Jungian perspective. So it seems to me that this breakthrough that I think I'm hoping for, and I think I hear everybody is anticipating something's trying to percolate through, and the role of mind in the universe seems to me to be central. That's my own personal bias.
Yeah, I would say even a couple of years ago, I was pretty skeptical about the notion of cosmic consciousness and that kind of hypothesis. Now I've come to think that it's real, that there is something real about some notion of an interdependence, interrelationship that is a superset of our exceedingly finite minds.
Well, Jung refers to an inner experience of self with a capital S, that we normally operate in the world on a subject-object basis. But if one encounters the self, that relationship is you're the object, that there is a subjective consciousness out there that is of which we're objects. And that's an experience that one can have, in quotes.
John Cobb, I see you were waving to get our attention.
Thank you. I just wanted to make one suggestion about a way in which a lot of people might be able to understand the limits of science and the importance of history. Science, I think, inherently can only deal with repetitive things. If an event simply occurs, but it's different from every other event, how would you deal with it scientifically? Yeah. You would find features of it that are repeatable, but the event itself is not. And history used to play a very large role in higher education, and it is fading because of the dominance of scientism. And even when you talk about the past, there's a tendency to be looking for repetitive things. But I think people know their own personal life story includes unique events, dramatic, unique events. In principle, they cannot be dealt with, but that doesn't make them less important. Mm. And then I wanted also just to comment. I'm very proud of the fact that I created this committee to advise the Center to advise the process movement on science. And I think it's the first time there has been a organization of this kind. And I think, Matt, you have your hands on something that is extremely important. And I hope all these folks are going to give you lots of support. I wish I could give you more. I can just say, I think we are very fortunate to have somebody like Matt
Oh, thanks, John.
to bring us together. And it's identifying the topics that need to be dealt with is going to be a very crucial role. And you can all help him. I don't mean, I'm not suggesting when I say he will be our leader. I'm not saying that leaders can't lead without a lot of other people.
Yeah.
I do need to do something else now, but I appreciate so much. I mean, I have a very strong sense that right now we are living, and I think several of you echoed this, we're living at a time when breakthroughs are possible. They're taking place in all sorts of ways. At the same time, the most powerful movements are trying to prevent the breakthroughs. And they have very good chance of leading to the suicide of the human race. I think if we give up history, because it's not repetitive, we will, there'll be no meaning to our lives because we won't have any story to live in.
Yeah.
Without a story, we are gone. Anyway, thank you very much. And Tim, you've done a wonderful job for us.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, John.
Yes. Thank you, John. Of course, none of us would be here doing this without John's inspiration. But this is going to be a team effort to carry this work forward. I agree with John that we're in this liminal moment now where a lot of ideas which would have been dismissed are now on the table. It's sort of we're in the midst of a civilizational mutation, and it's not clear which of the possible trajectories will be actualized. But now's the time, for us to do this work with great passion in an attempt to influence that future, which is fast approaching. So I think, Farzad, you're next. Why don't you go ahead and chime in? I'm sure you've got something fascinating to share.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, my head is exploding even more than I thought it would, which is generally a lot. So this is really, really amazing and wonderful. All the ground we've gone through today and the weeks and months before. Wow. So much here. The intersection of all these different thoughts. It's hard to know where to start. So start at the center, I guess, really, is the idea. I mean, from the very start when Tim ended his quick presentation with the LSD experiment across, large scale, generational, that kind of blew my mind. Didn't expect to see that right off there. But then the growing interest, as you know, Matt, you're involved with that Psychedelics and Philosophy conference series that I'm in with you as well. So much is happening so fast all around in so many different efforts like that, that it's fun to bring that into the picture in a real serious way, and suddenly there's many things to point to. So the little remark I made earlier about Islamic philosophy, Alam al-Mithal, the movie Dune, and the LSD experiment, all of that kind of blends together with the whole exploration of possibility. The very last thing you said about we're in a liminal moment of history where which possible trajectory can be taken, that's really what's at the core of the book Dune. The experience, that psychedelic type of experience that the protagonist has there, is to try to see, and it's a deterministic picture in Dune. I won't get into the whole plot there, but the author borrows a lot from Islamic culture, Middle Eastern culture, and Islamic philosophy. And so one strand of that that's of great interest to me, and more lately, is the Neoplatonic influence in Islamic philosophy, which kind of binds itself with the Pythagorean and Platonic influence to become the source of a lot of what is now generally referred to as Islamic occult sciences. And some serious work is being done in translating that and discussing it in a way that for the last, I guess, something like 25 or 30 years, occult sciences as a topic in Europe, European occult sciences, is legitimate, but the Islamic stuff has not been part of the scene, interestingly. And I think it has to do with cultural problems of really sidelining non-European cultures in general, especially when a lot of the core of Hellenistic philosophy comes through the Islamic translation and commentary and development effort, and then goes to Europe and then becomes European science, European occult science, regular science, and philosophy. So anyway, quick footnote there to deal with later, much later. But the thoughts of virtual reality and why that's sticking right now in such an intense way, and the simulation argument still there in such an intense way, and the panpsychism now getting kind of a lot of attraction in the analytics school. All of these are kind of, they're going for the right target, and they're doing it in all kinds of ways that are to be expected when you don't have broad enough, and you've already made up your mind about actualism and what's real. But they are authentic responses to something that could be done much better, and I think that's what we're talking about here. And that's what Tim has brought to the surface. Like, okay, we want to talk about these things. How do we do it in a way that can fasten on to good math, good science, good theoretical basis, really take in the humanities in a serious manner, the way of words and the way of context, and move forward. And so I see that all kind of coming together right here. So I'll make one comment about VR and simulation theory and Islamic philosophy, and then that's enough for now because there's just too much exploding at the same time. All right, so VR. The inventor of VR, Jaron Lanier, is amazingly critical, wonderfully critical about artificial intelligence and his invention of VR, which is now like 30 or 40 years old. And basically he says this thing that if we content ourselves with current technology, as you were saying before, Matt, and try to base our ontology on that, we're doing a really huge disservice to the concept of VR, to the concept of intelligence at all. And he maintains that. He always has maintained that in every presentation that he makes. What's the good way of doing VR? What's the authentic way of doing artificial intelligence in a way? That concept, Alam al-Mithal, which is part of Dune, he kind of picks up and refers to it nicely, but then he doesn't elaborate on it, is a major concept in Islamic philosophy, especially in mysticism. And it's that Alam means world and Mithal means images or likenesses. It's the layer in between the ideas and the world of particulars, or the physical world and the ideal world or conceptual world. Well, I should say ideal world. And it occupies that middle region, and lots of stuff is thrown in there. Lots of philosophical problems are handled by the existence of this basic world of, you might call it, theoretical entities, to be simplistic. But they include it in the ontology as an essential part, and it is the conduit through which ideas are potentiated. the potentia, the actualities are potentiated, as Mikhail was saying, through the activity of the intellect with its own concepts here at our level of intelligence, and that hooks up upward into the world of ideas. I'm abbreviating it mercilessly, but basically it is that layer in between that mediates and is the channel for that connection between human art, philosophy, intellectual effort, etc., and the potentia, what the forms might be called. And they elaborate on it in great length and detail. And so you visit that after death. That's the place of after life is finished. It's the place of dreams, prophetic dreams. It's the place of all prophecies. It's the place of intellectual exploration, out of body, you might say, which a lot of quantum theory is out of body, right? A lot of out of body thinking occurs in that place. It's given a reality, it's given an ontological status so that it can be harvested and used and then enacted back here. So there's a real up and down motion there. The Holy Spirit, if you will, is ontologized in this manner. And so that's VR. It's virtual, it's reality, and so forth. And it's just a really great place for exploration. It's not very familiar as a concept, I know, in philosophy or philosophical discussions, but it's a huge one in Islamic philosophy. And I think we'll be hearing more and more of this. I've been tapping into the young scholars who are working on both translation and commentary of things Islamic, and it's booming right now. It's in a renaissance as well. So a lot of good literature out there for that. That's all I'll say for now. I really enjoyed everything today. Everything is just lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Farzad.
Yeah, thank you,
wanna chime in,
Farzad.
Tim?
Great.
Yeah. Oh, it just occurs to me that, your reference to the occult sciences, whether Islamic or European or so-called esoteric science, that a lot of what falls under that category could be reinterpreted as an attempt to peer into this realm of or landscape of potentia. And because modern science has been actualist and materialist, that these other approaches to doing science, which would involve this sort of imaginative participation in this middle realm that you're describing, have been just dismissed as a holdover from the childish phase of human evolution or something. But it could be that with this new Logoi framework and other frameworks that are possibilist in orientation, that we could retrieve some of these esoteric and occult insights, put them in a new context, and understand better what these ancient practitioners were really attempting to do.
Absolutely. I love that. Yeah, I think so.
I see Anderson Weeks has his hand up.
Anderson. Go ahead, Anderson.
Hi, thank you. This is so exciting. I'm having so much fun. I wanted to go back to something that you said, Matt. You were talking about how panpsychism is growing in popularity, but then at the end of the day, there seems to be something missing or disappointing about it. And I think that's a rich topic because there's something very interesting going on. And I think it's good to be explicit about it. There's two kinds of panpsychism out there. And although it is growing in popularity, you're right that the analytic philosophers are attracted to the version that they find suggested by Russell. And there's a specific reason for that. They do feel a sort of guilt about the sort of exclusion of mind from nature, the marginalization of everything that classical physics can't explain. So there's a guilt about ignoring that or marginalizing it, evicting it from the universe. So they found a way to let it back in without making any concessions to anything. So the kind of mind that Russell is intimating is one that's locked on the inside, cabined in there, sealed off. So, okay, you've got it. There it is. Mind is back in nature, but it's hermetically sealed on the inside. And so you can have it all you want, but it's not going to make any difference to the outside. There's no interaction. There's no, it's not part of the development of anything on the outside, and the outside is not any part of the development on the inside. It reminds me exactly, it's exactly what Kant accomplished. How can you have a world that is scientifically knowable, but also a world in which we can have religion and morality and free will and yada, yada, yada? Well, you can't, according to Kant, but you could have both those worlds if you could find some strange way to juxtapose them in some sort of disjunctive or contrapositive relationship. Each one is the negation of the other. You can have both, but not at the same time. So you can be one or the other. They don't interact. They're separated. Each one neutralizes the other. It's the exact same thing. We have the outside of things. That's classical physics, and we can give them an inside too, but they'll never interact. Each one is the negation of the other. We'll have them both, but they're in this contrapositive relationship. So a lot of people who are doing panpsychism are doing it in this way that it is not really allowing for any kind of efficacy of mind in nature. It's a way of putting mind in nature. It's locking it away at a neutralized, cabined way to guarantee that we can't get accused of exercising it, right? Of evicting it from the universe. But we are actually inoculating a classical, mechanistic, actualistic view of the world of experience from any threat of that which we have now sealed inside as a kind of secret heart. And so we need to be careful. If I understood Jude correctly, I think she suggested, correct me if I misunderstood you, that Chalmers wanted you to give him a short intro or a quick way into Whitehead. If that's what I thought you said. I had the same problem with someone else. I won't name his name, but an equally famous person said, who does a lot of panpsychism stuff, said, well, I just never had time to read Whitehead. And he wanted me to give him some kind of a summary or, what 10 pages could he read? The problem is they know it's not just 10 pages. So we need to find some way to get them on board, make them loosen up their strictures, because they're using panpsychism in a way that does not, in fact, advance the problem, but cements the problem we have of not explaining how mind is part of nature.
Yeah, well said, Anderson. I agree. Anyone else want to share some thoughts on what Anderson is saying? I posted a comment there that there are a couple of books and dozens of articles wrestling with the so-called combination problem, which to my mind is a problem which arises precisely because of this hermetically sealed concept of mind that the analytic panpsychists are working with. The combination problem is, how do little minds add up to bigger minds? It's kind of an emergence issue, and William James, formulated this over a century ago in Principles of Psychology, I believe. Almost a century and a half ago. And but I think he also, at least James hints at the solution to the problem that he found also in the same passage. And Whitehead's process ontology, of course, provides us a way around the so-called combination problem, which is just a function of not taking relations seriously, I think. So we need to butt into these debates among the analytic panpsychists and just hold them down and force them to read some Whitehead, I guess.
Can I just jump in really quick?
Please.
I promise. This is a great conversation, and I especially like the reference to Neoplatonism when we were talking about this in the early phases of this topic, but also early on. So I forget who had brought up the issue of eternal objects as being. Well, I know Tim, you were talking about it as being one of the hiccups in process philosophy. A lot of people don't like it because it feels very Platonic, and it feels like it's. Wouldn't it be nice if Whitehead just hadn't mentioned eternal objects at all? But the way that connects to this discussion of consciousness, for me anyway, is that the Neoplatonists solved the problem, or at least, did something with Plato's concept of the archive by making these things essentially the conceptual objects within the mind of God, so that they pre-existed. There are these forms in a very Platonic sense that exist in their own reality, and they sort of participate in the world in different ways via, for Plato, it was methexis and mimesis, duplication or participation, but it was all very vague. And, but for Whitehead, he defines eternal objects in a very particular way at the very beginning, where he's going through all the categorical obligations. And he says they're they're to be understood as, I'm quoting, I think I might be messing it up a little bit, pure potentia or pure potentialities for the specific determination of fact. So for me, this means that there's a predicative form, a predicative pattern that's part of process. And the reason you need an eternal object is because you need to have some generic form. It's not a real potential that's rehabilitated through process. In other words, it's a predicative pattern that already existed back in the history of whatever it is you're talking about, whatever society or just globally, but rather it's it's something genuinely new. I mean, you don't have novelty without eternal objects, but they're not necessarily, the way I read them, they're not necessarily, pre-established patterns that exist in their own reality, but rather they are the thing that allows genuine novelty to occur. They're the things that allow you to assume there will be a predicative pattern in a relation, even a novel predicative pattern. It's sort of like the thing that allows novelty is actually the eternal object, which is generally the opposite of the way people treat eternal objects, or at least casually. They assume that means, oh, there's a pre-established pattern that is just comes into operation at some point. I don't look at eternal objects that way. And in terms of consciousness, I guess it's the idea that there can be this level of reality that is presupposed by this relational structure that we're all interested in, this process structure, a world not of information, but a world in formation perpetually, that for that to work, there has to be the presupposition of some level of relation that's beyond. And it participates, but it's sort of like a panentheistic way of looking at the theology in a way. Its consciousness is at home in the universe, but it's also the home of the universe being the universe as we conventionally mean the term. So it's part of it, but it also exceeds it. And you wouldn't have a universe without it. And to me, I don't know, that panpsychism, sometimes people play fast and loose with the phrase. It means different things to different people. Sometimes to me that this gets lost. People speak of it reductively sometimes, panpsychism. And that's why I like David's, reformulation of pan-experientialism, because it seems to be a little bit more, it has a promise of generalization that panpsychism as a phrase doesn't necessarily have. So I was just trying to tie this back to the discussion of eternal objects, but that's all I have to say on it. It's just something that I find interesting myself.
Yeah, and it's an important contribution, Michael. Thanks. I've had a opportunity to try to make a similar clarification with Terence Deacon, he mentions Whitehead in his book Incomplete Nature, but has this, I think, faulty interpretation of what Whitehead means, as if Whitehead was saying that that eternal objects limit novelty, which is the exact opposite of his intention. Right. And so there's some confusion there, and so we Whitehead interpreters have our work cut out for us on this point.
Yeah, Michael, thank you for your friendly amendment to our understanding of Whitehead. That's very insightful. I like it. So to speak, possibilities of evolution long-term, a archetypal forms of relation, that kind of thing, as opposed to something that's kind of fixed in the standard Platonic framing. Thank you.
Yeah. So we've reached the end of our extended time together today due to our delay. So I don't want to hold you any longer, but this is so much fun. I think we're going to need to find a way to continue the dialogues. There's so many avenues to explore here, so many threads that I'd like to continue weaving with all of you. So stay tuned for that. We have your email addresses, and we'll reach out to plan the next gathering, probably initially on Zoom, but we're also in conversation with the Cobb Institute and the Center for Process Studies about a real live in-person conference at some point in the future. So yeah, stay tuned. Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you, Michael. Thank you to all the contributors, the panelists, and participants. This has been such a wonderful series of seminars. They're all recorded. The first 8 are already on the Cobb Institute website, and this one will be posted soon. So if you've missed any, you can review them. I'll post the chat also there so that you can see all the comments. Thank you so much. And onward. We have work yet to do.
Thanks to all. Thank you, man. Thanks to all.